Hello, everyone. Again, this is Dr. David, and welcome to tonight's webinar. Remember, this is not to be used as a replacement for standard medical care. Be sure to consult with your physician or healthcare provider before you make any drastic changes. Very, very, very important. We are here to work with our healthcare providers and not in opposition to them. Here's a quote I really, really like. As knowledge with regard to the effects of food upon man increases, it is more than conceivable that the races or people that first avail themselves of the new values of nutrition may decrease the handicaps of disease, lengthen their lives, and so become the leaders of the future, by Victor B. Heiser. Now, you may not want to be a leader or rule the world, but you may certainly want to have a long life and enjoy a painless life. And basically, you want to make the most of your mind and body. And I think what we're finding out about coffee, for instance, I just find it amazing, really, really amazing. And Chris is going to really explain to us the wonders of coffee. I know that the coffee has been reviled for years, but I think the table is now turning. But let me tell you about Chris. Chris Fields is the Technical Director of Applied Sciences, Inc. I think it's up there in Wisconsin. She is an 18-year technical executive who has been instrumental in the development and manufacturing of several key innovations in the health sciences, nutrition, and food and beverage industries. She is a managing partner of Applied Food Sciences and is a developer of the Healthy Roast process used exclusively for Asante Java. Dr. Fields is a leader in the development, manufacturing, formulation, and clinical studies that led to the development of the revolutionary roasting process used to secure the antioxidant value of coffee beans. And a lot of you have heard about antioxidants. You're going to hear some even more interesting things about coffee and antioxidants. So without much further ado, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And I'm going to be handing this over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Dr. David, and thank you all for being here to join us this evening for a little while, and all you East Coasters who have to stay up late tonight with us, so we appreciate the time. So as Dr. David had said, I'm really here to tell you some interesting and emerging science on the truth about coffee and its health benefits. And we're very excited about all this emerging science because I think, you know, there's a lot of media attention out there around coffee. Everybody loves to talk about coffee. And the message is confusing right now because historically we've known that coffee has some health benefits, but most of the historical data has been negative, or doctors weren't quite sure on it. You know, did it cause hypertension? Did it raise blood pressure? And so they kind of steered most of their patients away from it. And it's not only been in the last recent years, probably in the last 10 years, where we've seen a lot of clinical evidence, cohort studies, and epidemiological data that has come through that has really defined and dedicated itself to showing us that coffee does have all these wonderful beneficial health benefits, and we're just really starting to realize what they're about. So today I'm going to tell you all about those that information and hopefully put it in a context that you can really understand. So before I start, I really want to just go over a little bit about applied food sciences so you get a little bit of sense of who we are and what we do. We're basically a health and wellness company dedicated to providing nutritional solutions to the entire food, beverage, and supplement industries, and we do this through plant-based natural selections. And what that really means is that we're trying to harness the power of natural plant-based foods, find the compounds in those foods, and develop them in a way that we can put them in the food supply, we can put them in beverages, we can fortify them into foods, and bring them to consumers so that they can benefit from those without increasing the cost, without impacting the sensory profile of it. So our goal really is to try and find those things in nature that have the beneficial health effects and put them in the food supply that's currently out there. And how we do that is through a number of different vehicles. So we create some functional ingredients. We also make custom formulations for the food and beverage industry. We even go so far as to make product prototypes for our customers to be able to really help them understand the value of what the product's going to look like. And then we have what I call our research collaborations, which is really the heart of our technology pipeline. And that gives us the ability to go forward and be able to understand how science can be applied and commercialized in a way that works. And it is actually through our affiliation with the AMC Cancer Research Center and all the work that we had done there that really developed what we know and how we're ingrained into the coffee industry that we are today. We were actually on a quest at the time to really kind of look at all of these plant-based compounds and determine which one of them had really strong antioxidant activity for reducing reactive oxygen species, which essentially helps with cellular health and reduces the incidence of cancer. And what we found as we were kind of screening through many of the plants, and this ranged everything from botanicals and the wild Amazon all the way through to conventional teas that we currently have on the market today. And we found that there are specific compounds in coffee, and mainly in the green coffee bean, that have really positive effects on helping with antioxidant protection. And they do this because they're very soluble compounds. And when I say they're soluble, that means our bodies like them, they readily absorb them, and they use them quickly. And a lot of antioxidants in plant-based compounds we found are very complex molecules. And it takes our bodies a while to adjust and adapt to them and to be able to break them down into a form that we can use them in. So you'll find as we go through this presentation today that not all antioxidants are created equal, but the antioxidants that we find in coffee are very good and powerful for blood health and plasma health and antioxidant health within our heart because they are soluble and we can readily absorb them into our bloodstream really quickly. So we actually embarked, and we do this with many of the processes that we develop. We embarked on really trying to understand and fully integrate ourselves into coffee. And we have this is an image of the coffee farm that we partner with down in Central America. And as you can see, it's a very lush vegetative farm, and it's beautiful. And it gives us really a firsthand knowledge of not just how we process coffee today, but how we can grow it, how we can harvest it, how we can process it out in the field, how we can manage the roasting, and how we can deliver that package to the consumer. So this really is a full sensibility of it. And here's just another image of it, just so you get a full appreciation of the farm, because you can see there's so much other vegetation on there. You can see there's some banana trees that are popping up in the background, and there's waterfalls all through there. But this right here, this is a picture of the coffee plant itself. And the coffee plant is a really big leafy green plant. And, you know, and I wish I had an image, and I was just thinking about this, of what a very commercialized coffee farm looks like, because it looks a lot different than our farm, because you'll see just a bunch of coffee trees in rows, whereas our farm is fully integrated, it's shade grown, and that's how we can really determine the impact of all the environmental influences on how we can basically make a more powerful antioxidant-based final bean. And so this is what the ripe coffee bean looks like once it's ready to be picked from that big stalky plant that you see there. And one of our coffee pickers is actually doing that, and they're putting it in the basket. And this is a kind of a close-up vision of what that coffee plant looks like. So you can see some of the green beans in there, and then you can also see the coffee cherries right there too. And it's pretty neat because this really does give us a true indication. I don't know if you can see. So that's the coffee cherry. That's the one that we pick, and then we leave the greens on the plant until they're ready to go. So we'll spend close to anywhere between 2 to 3 months just harvesting coffee. So this is what it looks like once we take that red cherry off of there and we take the hull off of it and the mucous membrane. We're left with this green coffee bean right here. And this green bean is basically, as you can see, it's got a, oops, sorry about that. It's got many different profiles to it, and that's how coffee is actually graded on the market today. So, and we try and get coffee that actually has a nice round appeal to it. See some of these smaller ones right there, you can see they're a lower grade coffee and they won't produce the right flavor and aroma and sensory profile. And then the coffee that you know is basically the one the one that you see here on the right-hand side of the screen, and that's the roasted coffee. And this just shows you a really nice profile of all the different roast types. So you can see some of the beans are darker and some of the beans are lighter, and the lighter beans are typically roasted at a lighter temperature, 440 degrees as opposed to 450 degrees for the darker roasts, or for a shorter period of time, and that just changes the sensory profile as well as some of the other parameters within the coffee. So let's go through some terminology just to give you an idea of, when we talk about organic coffee, really what we're talking about is crop production standards. And really this is all about just preserving the integrity of the land by not using pesticides, herbicides, and keeping things as organic as possible on the seeds that you use, minimizing your genetic engineering, reducing any kind of contamination with, maybe adjacent waterways and that sort of thing. But organic crop production is really an evolution. We're really learning a lot more about how we manage it through natural selections and over synthetic made products, and how we can actually help make basically all natural herbicides and pesticides from some of the things that are grown right on the farm. And it also has to do with our handling practices. So basically how we handle the crops coming into and out of the farm all have to be managed and separated. The entire farm down in Honduras that I showed you is actually organic in nature, but that just gives you an idea of what's involved in organic processing. And to be organic, you have to 100% organic. You have to have more than 95% of all the contents of your package organic in nature. But if you want to use made with organic, you can actually be up to 75%. So there's just a little bit of terminology change. But anytime you see the USDA organic seal, it really needs to have those requirements on it. But really, the whole message here is that organic processing, whether it's coffee or anything else, basically reduces our toxic loading because it reduces chemicals that are used, which helps maintain the environment and provides a more safer grounds for everybody long term. And then we have what I think is one step above organic certification, and that's Rainforest Alliance certification. And that basically incorporates everything from organic, but it also looks at the ecosystem as a whole. So it looks at waterways, waste management. It also has a big piece of it in fair treatment and conditions for workers and community relations, as well as wildlife conservation. So we're looking at the entire ecosystem that's involved in that processing and making sure we manage all the elements associated with that. So if there is, one thing when you talk about sustainability and good practices, RFA is definitely one of those seals that you want to look for. There is another seal called Fair Trade. And fair trade is specific to just basically giving a fair wage to the individuals who are harvesting the coffee. I'm not going to advocate against or for that specifically. I have seen some of the benefits work in some of the communities, and in other ones it doesn't because the monetary value goes right to the broker. So, but I do think that organic and obviously is a fundamental appeal. And the Rainforest Alliance is all about the ecosystem and preserving it. And as you can see, from the image here, it's not just the coffee that we're preserving. It's all the animals on the farm and all the other vegetative crops like the banana trees and so. So really here we're going to talk specifically about coffee antioxidants today because really that's where the nutritional value and that's where the health are coming from. And all the media attention that you're hearing about some of these health benefits of coffee are really all related to the coffee antioxidants. And namely, it's the polyphenols, which are coming from the green coffee bean that are giving us this additional health benefit. So what are coffee antioxidants? Well, they're found naturally in the green beans, and actually the plants produce them as a reaction to basically UV light and just the elements. So, and that's the same with all the other plant-based compounds. They just basically naturally produce antioxidants just like we do in our bodies. But what makes coffee's antioxidants unique is they're water soluble. So they have basically all these nice initial benefits to heart health and plasma health, as well as some secondary benefits, which we're going to talk about today with glucose metabolism. And they basically, have an emerging science around them, because it's just in the last 5 to 6 years that we really understood the value of this glucose metabolism that we'll get into. So what are polyphenols? Well, polyphenols are really a group of antioxidants that are capable of neutralizing free radicals before they can cause harm to our body cells. So they basically are protecting our DNA against oxidative damage. And we're going to talk a lot about what oxidative damage is and oxidative stress. But basically, it's a consequence or an imbalance of the level of antioxidants versus the level of reactive oxygen species that are in our bodies. So polyphenols are bioactives that can affect lots of things like our vascular function, signaling, and inflammation activity, and so on. But ultimately, what it does help us do is it'll help us reduce our blood pressure and increase endothelial function. It increases cell longevity and reduces negative cell growth by reducing negative gene expression. So we have a lot of data that shows us in models how this works, and now we have even more data to show us that it's really working in humans. So how does it work, and why are they good for us? Again, they neutralize free radicals, and we're going to talk about what that means, which ultimately reduce the risk of disease and prevent cellular damage. They also increase glucose efficiency. The specific polyphenols in coffee have the ability to manage and regulate the amount of glucose or sugar that's basically going into and out of the bloodstream. They also can help reduce LDL oxidation, which ultimately leads to a risk in cardiovascular disease and a reduced risk of inflammation. So how do antioxidants work? Well, this is basically a normal oxygen atom, and it's in our bodies, it's in everybody's bodies, and when we metabolize carbohydrates and form glucose and create energy through the Krebs cycle, we basically form this normal oxygen atom, and as it's basically spinning, it loses electrons, and that's what's called the free radical in our body. So this is happening to us, and it's a physiological function for normal cellular activity, so it's happening all the time. Well, the negative consequences is that free radicals set off these chain reactions on the cell membrane wall, and they eventually lead to erosion and deterioration. So what antioxidants do is they basically put that electron back. So they basically donate it back, and they stabilize that molecule so it can't cause damage and set off that chain reaction. So how do free radicals form in the first place? Well, there's lots of different ways that they form. I mean, you've heard some of them. Some of them are from sun damage and UV light. Other ones are from radiation and smoke. Some are from the pollution that we're ingesting. Some of them are from inflammation when we get hurt or when we have a breakdown in our immunity. But quite honestly, most of them happen from normal cellular metabolism. And whether it's through processing lipids as we eat the food we ingest, or whether we're generating energy through the Krebs cycle, it's a normal reactionary process to form these free radicals. So we're going to have them no matter what. The other thing that kind of introduces free radicals and damage and where antioxidants come into play is when we look at other stressors in our lives, like elevated cortisol levels, which happen when we're nervous or anxious or upset or stressed about something, or when we introduce toxins into our body from preservatives or chemicals that we're eating, or the things that we're putting on our body, or through some of the drugs that were prescribed. They all have the negative side effect because they contain carriers to efficiently put them into our bodies and let our bodies utilize them. So antioxidants help us with that by basically binding or allowing us to donate that electron and getting rid of the negative energy associated with those free radicals so they can't damage the cells. So this is a pretty amazing thing. And when we talk about, well, how does this all relate to health and wellness? And how does it relate to coffee? We look at how coffee specifically combats aging. And, one of the studies that I think a lot of people have heard about is this hypertension information. So basically, in the past, we've all heard about how high blood pressure is a negative effect of drinking too much coffee. And really, there was no substantial evidence to that. There was some relative subjective data, but it was short-term data. There wasn't a lot of information related to what we call mechanisms of action, so how it was really relating to the science and all of the data which was showing, these causal relationships. So this hypertension study came out, and it was published on WebMD, and it really said that coffee actually may help combat high blood pressure because there's phytochemicals in there, which are these antioxidants that I've been talking about, that combat blood vessel aging. So let's talk about how they really do this and how it relates to this antioxidant activity that I'm specifically talking about. So this is basically what happens is over time we have this thing called platelet aggregation, which is essentially the formation of oxidative LDL that's stressed and becomes plaque buildup in all of our arteries and in our veins, and in some of us it happens faster or quicker than others. Well, the antioxidants, specifically in coffee, because they're so soluble, they can help avoid all this. So let's look at how this works closely. You'll see here that this is basically a normal blood flow through our endothelium. So this is through our blood vessel, and it's unrestricted. But as time progresses and LDL is oxidized, we have this plaque formation building up on here. And what the goal of the antioxidants is to basically help with vasodilation. So many of us understand how vasodilation works. It's basically the effects of widening of the blood vessels to relax the smooth muscle cells so that we get nice, smooth blood flow through our veins and our arteries. And sometimes when we don't have this, we go on things like vasodilators, which assist the blood, especially in hypertensive individuals. So how does this plaque actually build up? Well, you know, this is actually a slide taken from Dr. Lindell when he gave his heart health basic presentation. And really, it's kind of a rudimentary approach to understanding how plaque builds up. And it talks specifically about inflammation and how it all happens. But let's suppose that you get a splinter in your skin. You'll see that all of a sudden you see all this bacteria coming to the site. And we have white blood cells, which basically help by these messengers, these cytokines and these histamines. They're messengers, and they tell the white blood cells, hey, you better get busy and you better go defend the body against this bacteria. So it goes in there and it starts to basically eliminate the bacteria. But as it does this, it goes from a monocyte into a macrophage. And this white blood cell changes in formation. And over time, this formation ends up building up, and you can physically see that. So when you look at a damage from a splinter or maybe a cut on your skin, you can see that you have basically this inflammation going on the surface of the skin. You can see the redness. You can see sometimes a bump forming. And that's the same way that plaque builds up from LDL oxidation in our bodies. So the LDL is basically introduced from our bloodstream, from the foods that we eat, and the white blood cells act the same way. They look at that LDL and they say, well, I have to get rid of it. So they basically consume it into the white blood cell, and eventually it dies and it becomes a foam cell, and it lends itself to basically going onto the arterial wall and creating what we know as a fatty streak formation on the cell wall of the endothelial. So basically this is inside of the blood vessel lining, and over time this accumulation will get larger and larger and larger. And you'll see that this is the normal artery, and as inflammation builds up and those white blood cells continue to create into foam cells, the plaque continues to form, and ultimately we start to restrict blood flow. So where does LDL oxidation come into this? Well, essentially what's happening is, so here's our blood flow going through here. Here's basically, this is a cross-sectional view now. If you're looking at your inside of your blood flow in your basically your blood vessel, you'll see these LDL go in through the endothelial layer, and they basically form these foam cells, which ultimately end up in this plaque buildup on the main wall. And oxidized LDL is the reaction that happens with that. So this is a better view and a better picture of really what's going on here that I wanted to share with you, because it makes it so much easier and so much clearer to really understand what's going on. So we know that atherosclerosis is a chronic inflammatory disease of the arterial wall. And it's the major cause of morbidity and mortality in cardiovascular disease in much of the world's population. This disease involves the formation of plaques on the arterial wall as we're looking at it, right? So basically what's happening is it's restricting blood flow and increasing the risk of occlusion, which ultimately can lead to things like myocardial infarction. So we now know that basically it's the oxidation of the LDL and this oxidative stress that really characterizes this plaque buildup on the arterial wall. So if we can actually eliminate the buildup of this oxidized LDL, we can ultimately control the amount of plaque buildup in the lining of the blood vessels. So these lipoproteins, which are basically made from the liver, so the liver basically transfers it into basically VDL, so which is a very low density lipoprotein produced in the liver. It's converted to LDL by the action of this thing called the lipase, which is an enzyme that hydrolyzes triglycerides and then removes them from the VDL LDL particle and ultimately releases what we know as free fatty acids into our bloodstream. So LDL basically is the root cause of free fatty acids in our bloodstream. So when we go to the doctor and the doctor gives us a cholesterol scan, really what he's looking at is he's looking at how much of this LDL was produced by the liver and is now basically converted into free fatty acids into our bloodstream, because that's going to tell us a lot about basically how much is going to basically penetrate through and get oxidized. So the first step, one of the first steps in the development of sclerosis is basically the passage of LDL out of this arterial lumen through the endothelial layer and into this subendothelial. And once that happens, that's where the oxidation of LDL goes on. From these reactive oxygen species and some of these other enzymes, basically they bind to this LDL and they oxidize it. And the white blood cell comes in and it says, okay, I better do my job. And the cytokine is basically telling it to do its job. And so it's grabbing all these oxidized LDLs and it's forming this foam cell, which ultimately goes and forms this arterial plaque buildup on the wall. And over time, we see that it just continues to keep getting larger and larger, and the plaque eventually protrudes into the arterial lumen and causes an obstruction of the arterial blood flow, which you can see there. And that's basically what a myocardial infarction is, and that's how strokes result, is from an acute occlusion that is due to the transformation of this thing called the thrombus. So that's how the whole chemistry works. So if we can control this oxidized LDL, and we can do that through different medications. So atherosclerosis is an inflammatory disorder, but it can be initiated by the accumulation and subsequent oxidation of LDL in the arterial intima. So when we try and treat the problem, therapeutic interventions are typically focused on lowering this LDL, right? But we can also treat the problem by blocking LDL oxidation, and that's what antioxidants in coffee do for us. They can inhibit that LDL oxidation for us. So coffee antioxidants to the rescue. So basically, it's the same principle. All they're doing is they're providing that free radical by the unpaired electron so that we don't get the oxidized LDL, so eventually we don't get that plaque buildup. And how do we know this? So we have all kinds of different models that basically can tell us, you know, how well certain compounds are doing at managing lipoprotein protection. And we can see here, this was a study that was done at the University of Scranton by Dr. Joe Vinson, and he was comparing the compounds in coffee relative to the compounds in some of the other beverages that are typical in the human diet. And you can see that coffee antioxidants have a really strong affinity to get rid of this oxidized LDL, and it is because of their water solubility and their really simplistic makeup of the polyphenols, which are the phenolic acids in coffee that give it this ability. But we also have other models that give us the ability and other science that support this. And this is basically looking at many different compounds. As you can see, coffee is one of them. But we actually look at some of the compounds in tea, for example, the catechins, caffeic acid, and GCA or CGA, which are also found in coffee. But other things like gallic acid, which is found in grapes, relative to vitamin E that you hear a lot about, and vitamin C, which is ascorbic acid, and even beta-carotene. And you can see that coffee, by far, has the ability to inhibit oxidation significantly further than even tocopherol can in most models, because it has the ability to quickly and readily get right into that lipoprotein and stop the oxidation reaction from happening. So let's look at, and I'm going to continue to repeat this, so when I'm going to give you some data and I'm going to give you some of the supporting information as to how it works and what we call the mechanism of action of how this LDL oxidation is forming and how the antioxidant affects it. And then we're going to go through some of the science. And the science really is talking about the studies. And when I say studies, most of them are related to cohort studies. And cohort studies basically evaluate a population with a condition-specific state, such as hypertension, for example, or high blood pressure, and how basically they're affected versus a control population over a period of time. And we're evaluating what's causing this hypertension or what's causing this. And it's very similar to what we know as an epidemiological study, which is a study of a disease in a populated group of individuals, for example. And what we're looking at is how, why, or what the reason is that they're in this disease state. So most of the data that we're going to talk about today is looking at these cohort studies, and why they're a good use of information for us is because they can look at a large number of people and they can say some significant causal relationships between them. So the first study that I point out is really specific to caffeine intake and the risk of hypertension, because I think a lot of people have always had this association between caffeine causes elevated blood pressure and ultimately leads to hypertension. And this study really does demonstrate that it really does depend on the individual, not necessarily on the caffeine itself. And many individuals have already created what they call a tolerance factor to caffeine, so it really doesn't have as significant of effect on hypertension. And actually just the reverse has been shown to be demonstrated, that coffee intake can actually reduce the risk of hypertension, especially in individuals who typically consume coffee. So this is an example of the data that's shown. So there's an individual or a group of individuals basically that have a control. Basically, they're not consuming coffee, and then subjects that are consuming coffee. And you can see the light green are the subjects that don't consume, and the dark green are the ones that do. And there's a significant difference in the level of diastolic blood pressure that's seen over a 3-month period with just 4 cups of coffee a day. And the same holds true for systolic blood pressure. So we're seeing that independent of the individual, we're seeing that if you look at an entire group of a population and say, what if they're consuming 4 cups a day, we're definitely seeing a significant difference in blood pressure. So, another study that we've kind of talked a lot about and you've seen in USA Today is that drinking coffee can actually help you with reducing your risk of heart disease. And this really goes back to what we were all saying about LDL oxidation reduction and blood flow, but it also has to do with inflammation and oxidative stress. And we talk about oxidative stress and how it drives cell damage and death. It drives DNA damage, which ultimately leads to heart disease and neurological diseases, as well as aging and other chronic inflammation. So, inflammation is a word that's kind of emerging for us in the scientific community too, because we now know and understand that inflammation is the root cause of many, many diseases. So it's not just the fact that inflammation ultimately leads to arterial or plaque buildup. It has more to do with the fact that inflammation leads to cell damage, cell stress, which puts our bodies and our body's organs in a state that basically they're not happy with. So that leads to hypertension, Alzheimer's, depression, arthritis, stroke, heart disease, all these things. So if we can control inflammation, which is what antioxidants do, so they do it by basically donating that electron at many different cellular levels. We looked at the LDL functionality, but it also does it just with normal cell growth and cell repair as well. So remember before I talked about oxidative stress and what it is, and it's basically an imbalance of antioxidants to the amount of free radicals that we are actually producing in our bodies. So if we can actually enhance the level of antioxidants in our bodies, and that's through the foods we eat, and it's through the right nutrition that we get, and it's also through the right lifestyle changes that we make, that we can actually get our bodies out of an oxidative stress state and ultimately reduce that inflammation level. So if we look specifically at inflammation, we know that there's these wonderful biomarkers that we can have to really understand, and we do this through what we call clinical studies. So clinical studies evaluate how specific treatments, or how specific products or specific ingredients can treat or affect an outcome. And in this case, most of our outcomes are what we call biomarkers. So there's certain biomarkers that we use for heart disease. There's certain, like, for example, cholesterol is one of them that doctors use for heart disease now. Another one is blood pressure. But there's also biomarkers that we use for inflammation. And these two studies specifically demonstrate the causal effect between the biomarkers for oxidative stress and coffee consumption. And the first one that I want to talk about, which is exciting because it's the isoprostanes. And the isoprostanes are actually one of the very few reliable biomarkers that we have for in vivo lipid peroxidation today. So as you can see from the data, basically the number of cups of coffee per day as the number of increases, we see basically a decrease in these isoprostanes. So isoprostanes are oxidative modifications that result from free radicals that to cell membranes in the phospholipids and the recirculating LDLs. So they're direct correlative effects of LDL oxidation. But we also have other biomarkers for inflammation, and these are some of the ones that you might be familiar with if you've ever gotten, for example, a standard blood test. E-selectin is one of them. And we see the same kind of data emerging, where basically up to 1 to 4 cups a day basically reduces your loading by about 20%. But there's a significant drop between the 1 to 4 cups a day and the 5 to 7 cups a day, where you see a significant decrease in the amount of E-selectin. And E-selectin is a measurement of inflammation in the endothelial cells. Basically what it does is it recruits leukocytes to the site of the injury on the endothelial cell and blood vessel walls. So and this is actually also triggered by insulin activity. So if you have an elevated insulin level, you'll also see elevated E-selectin levels. But ultimately, as you can see, just greater than 2 cups a day has a positive impact on inflammation. And finally, another one that I think you might all be familiar with is what we call the C-reactive protein. This is a protein that's found in the blood, which has a direct correlation to inflammation. And it's very acute, which means it happens very quickly. So this is a really nice biomarker for us to use because it could quickly tell you once you consume something, for example, coffee, you can almost see the positive effects of it almost immediately. Unfortunately, there's a lot of other things that go into play when we talk about CRP levels, and it's just not specific to inflammation, but lots of other things as well. So, but it's a good biomarker nonetheless. And I think you know the data is out there and it's strong and it's overwhelming, and it definitely shows that the antioxidants in coffee have the ability to reduce LDL oxidation reduction, which ultimately leads to a reduction in plaque buildup, and it also can reduce inflammation. And there's several different biomarkers that we now know and understand that have been shown to basically reduce this in lots of different clinical studies. So that's kind of the information on antioxidants. But the good news doesn't really stop there, because the antioxidants in coffee also have the ability to help us control and manage our risk reduction for diabetes. And diabetes, we all know, is a metabolic disorder, and we've heard lots and lots about it. It's a chronic disease marked by high levels of recirculating sugar, glucose into the bloodstream. And Dr. Oz has been a big advocate of talking about, you know, how coffee consumption basically can reduce that risk, because there's been a lot of studies in the last 5 years that have really supported that. And it's come out of a lot of the cohort studies that I was talking about, and a lot of the data has been published on how you can actually manage and control your glycemic index. And that's really the root cause of how this is all coming about and how it's all happening. So, you know, there's lots of different publications out there, but basically the glycemic index is the rate at which your body raises blood sugar level according to the food that you take. So low GI foods are foods that are less than 55. Medium GI foods are 55 to 70, and high GI foods raise your glycemic index above 70. So these are impactful, and these basically dictate the amount of insulin that is triggered in your body. So if you can control the amount of glycemic index and the glycemic response, you can actually control the rate of insulin activity in your blood. And what's the health benefits of managing your glycemic index? Well, it basically helps you lose and manage weight. It increases your body sensitivity to insulin, which has all these other beneficial effects to it. It improves diabetes management. It reduces your risk of heart disease, and we'll talk about that link and that causal effect. It improves your blood cholesterol levels, and it reduces your hunger because, as you can see from the graph that I just showed you, basically you're extending your metabolism for a longer period of time, so you're not as hungry on those low GI foods as you are for the high GI foods, which is why when you have a high-carb meal, and a lot of times you'll automatically feel very full and bloated, but then maybe a couple hours later, all of a sudden you're starving and you're hungry and you're wondering, well, how can I be so hungry when I just ate a big meal? Well, it's because you basically had a high glycemic peak and a high sugar peak, and all of a sudden, all of that's gone now, and your body's compensated for it because thankfully your insulin levels work. But for those who are diabetic or pre-diabetic, their insulin activity doesn't work anymore, and so they continue to have the negative side effects associated with that. And what are those negative side effects? So blood glucose is affecting lots of different organs in our bodies, and it affects them in lots of different ways. But essentially what's happening is blood glucose triggers the activity in the storage of glucose into and out of the liver. So that's where it all basically starts. It basically drives and dictates how much sugar is stored in the liver as glycogen, and we need that for basically energy reserves. The rest of it is gone into the muscle cells, and what's not uptook into the muscle cells ultimately ends up in the adipose tissue. So as you can see, it's not just fat that creates fat, it's sugar that creates fat, because once the glycogen stores are full, so our glycogen levels are only, a certain max capacity, and then once our muscle cells are full, the rest of the food that we intake is carbohydrates, which ultimately breaks down into glucose, ultimately breaks down into sugar, ends up in the adipose tissue. And what blood glucose does is it basically sends a signal to our pancreas, which forms insulin. Insulin is a chemical hormone that basically drives and tells our body to force sugar or glucose into these cells. So it's basically an activity that says, hey, I don't want glucose in my bloodstream. Put it here or put it here because this is full. So that's insulin's role in managing the whole activity of it. And what we call it when everything's in balance is we call it homeostasis. So that's when we have what we call normal blood glucose levels, which is about 90 to 100 milligrams per milliliter. So ultimately, let's look at the entire cycle here. So when we have an imbalance, so we have a high level of blood glucose. So let's say we eat some pasta for dinner. This basically elevates our glucose levels in our bloodstream, which sends a signal to our pancreas and triggers insulin activity. Well, insulin activity stimulates us to basically store glucose as glycogen in the liver, and also stimulates the uptake by the tissue cells. So these are the muscles, and when the muscles are full and when the glycogen stores are full, remember what it does is go to the adipose tissue. And then ultimately what ends up happening, because the glucose is going out of the bloodstream and into these areas, we actually start to lower our blood sugar level back down to our normal level. And a lot of times we lower it past the point of homeostasis, so we get that imbalance effect, which ultimately tells our pancreas to store glucagon, which to basically follow the glucagon pathway and take all those glycogen stores that we stored in this positive state and start to use them for glucose. And it stimulates glucose breakdown in the liver. So that's why glycogen is really important, and that's why the liver is a really important hepatic system for managing our glucose, because it keeps our body in check. It keeps our blood glucose levels in check. And by controlling the rate of glucose metabolized, we can manage the rate which glucose enters into the bloodstream and ultimately impacts insulin activity. Well, the good news is that coffee antioxidants have the ability to help us regulate this action via a pathway called the glucose 6-phosphatase pathway. So that's the primary pathway that all of our bodies take to manage that first step in the glucose metabolism. So this is what our normal glucose looks like in our bloodstreams. But when we have excess glucose, because our insulin activity is desensitized, or because we just ate a large meal, which is what we call in our absorptive state, so it's our feeding state, this is what our bloodstream looks like. So ultimately, this triggers all this activity. So we're forcing, the insulin is triggered, and it's forcing glycogen stores, it's forcing it into the cell wall, and it's forcing the sugar into the adipose tissue, all because insulin's telling it to do that. And that's supposed to work that way. But what's the negative side effects with all this insulin activity? Well, over time, what ends up happening is we become insulin desensitive, which is why we have all of these issues related to metabolic syndrome and diabetes. And the negative side effects with that are seen here. So if you look specifically at the green arrows, you'll see that That is what happens when we have insulin activity in our bodies. And what that means is when glucose is basically in free form and insulin is telling our bodies to uptake glucose, we're basically storing that as fat tissue, and we're storing that in glycogen, and we're not doing the reverse of that, which is lipolysis. So we're not breaking down fat, we're not releasing those fatty acids and using those for energy. And ultimately what ends up happening is we continue to keep storing that, and as our insulin activity becomes more and more desensitized, we end up following that green arrow more and more, and the gray path less and less. So if we can, so this is a pretty complex system on how we manage glucose, but you can see essentially what happens is if you can manage this first process, which is the glucose 6-phosphatase pathway, you can now control and regulate how much is being controlled and sent into your body to ultimately form action on energy. And if we can control or even mitigate the amount of glucose that goes into the liver for glycogen stores and the amount that goes into the pyruvate cycle for energy, we can force our bodies to basically break down triglycerides through lipolysis into the Krebs cycle for energy. So that's a pretty important thing, and it tells us a lot of things, because if we can force ketogenesis, which is fatty acid breakdown, we can basically reduce the amount of triglycerides that are recirculating in our bloodstream, and we can reduce our adipose storage, or our fatty acid storage, which is all a good thing for all of us. So this is an important point, and it really dictates and drives the new science around how coffee is really helping with diabetes prevention. Is it's really helping with manage this pathway right here. So we can actually control and manage how much insulin is basically activated, because insulin is only activated when our blood glucose levels get high enough to activate it. If it stays in that homeostasis state, which is basically when it should stay in there anytime that we're not physically eating food, then we should never really have a problem with insulin activity until we get to a point where we're predisposed diabetic. So here's the science. I mean, there's so much data out there. I think in the last 3 years I've read over 50 published studies demonstrated a strong causal relationship between coffee intake and the reduced incidence of type 2 diabetes. And one of the most promising ones that was published in 2007 in Diabetes Research and Clinical Practice basically studied a significant number of individuals, over 2,000 individuals, and it demonstrated that there is an inverse relationship between coffee consumption and metabolic syndrome and the components of metabolic syndrome. And as you can see, the mean coffee consumption in milligrams per day at its highest rate, 160 mils per day, had 0 syndrome components to it, which meant it basically your reduction or your risk was almost mitigated to 0. And obviously, as you dropped to 96 milligrams per day, you had 3 or more. But really, it's pretty overwhelming evidence. And this is another data point. This was published in 2009, and this is a really important study that's called the Strong Heart Study. And it did look at a lot of different categories, and it adjusted for a lot of different demographic groups. But really what it was looking at the link between cardiovascular disease and diabetes and coffee consumption and some of the other factors associated with smoking and alcohol intake. And the overwhelming evidence here is that there is a significant dose-dependent response to the intake of coffee consumption and the reduction of diabetes. And this is where a lot of the data that you hear about and the one that Dr. Oz talks about come from, and it's essentially saying that there's a 30% reduction in women and up to a 54% reduction in men with coffee consumption, up to 4 glasses a day. And, and here's, so that's cohort studies, and now we also do what we call clinical studies, and clinical studies are basically, again, looking at those biomarkers. So we can actually give individuals coffee, and we can measure their glucose. And we can see that there's a nice dose-dependent relationship between the intake of coffee consumption and the reduction in blood glucose levels. And so as you drink 2 cups of coffee a day, you'll see a 10% reduction in your glucose levels. So if your glucose level is at 50, it's now 10% reduced. And as you continue to go up to about 5 cups a day, you can see it's almost a 25% reduction in blood glucose loads. So what that means is that you can actually help yourself when you're eating, for example, sugar or carbohydrate-based foods that might have a higher glycemic index, you can actually lower the glycemic index of those foods or your body's response to them just by pairing that with coffee. And that's a pretty profound thing to do. I mean, if you think about it, it's just like basically taking a low glycemic food instead of a higher glycemic food, the way it looks at your blood sugar level. So let's say, for example, instead of eating, you know, an egg, which is a low glycemic index, you eat some white bread. Well, if you had coffee with it, you can basically reduce the loading of that white bread to a point where it's manageable in your body. So that's a pretty significant thing, and I think a lot of the data is basically demonstrating that that's where the activity really comes from. So what's the link between diabetes and heart disease? Well, it really comes down to this ugly thing called insulin again, because in addition to the excess glucose uptake in the adipose and the muscle tissue, insulin also triggers lots of other chemical functions that are negative to our bodies. Decreased insulin sensitivity affects our blood flow, so it decreases our blood flow. It basically increases our heart rate. It increases the amount of sodium intake that we have, and it causes an increase in fatty acid, liver, and elevated triglycerides, all of which have negative effects on heart health. So there's a strong causal link between diabetes, and actually the data is pretty overwhelming. I mean, 7 out of every 10 diabetics is going to have some kind of cardiovascular implication or problem related to that disease, and most will die from cardiovascular disease. So it really is a strong causal link and a real problem. But a discussion on coffee and health wouldn't be complete without specifically talking about caffeine. And I know caffeine is one of those buzzwords because it does create a lot of buzz, meaning it's supposed to give you energy, and it does, and there's enough scientific evidence to support the fact that it does increase what we call thermogenesis. So it enhances our metabolic activity, so it's giving us a boost in energy, which is why a lot of people like it when they take it in the morning. It makes them feel, you know, more awake and alert. It helps with mental clarity and mental acuity, and all those studies are out there and they're published, and that's pretty well known in the literature. But one of the things that we don't really understand, and that's kind of emerging, is its ability to actually help with muscle development and muscle formation and muscle recovery. And so I think, you know, that's an area of emerging science, and we've seen studies that have been published in Sports and Exercise which basically demonstrate that individuals who drank more than 2.5 cups of coffee a few hours before exercise were able to basically increase their endurance and their performance. And then there's that other positive benefit. Because oxidative damage happens when your body is working through physical exertion, you'll have higher levels of recirculating antioxidants. Well, the antioxidants in coffee can actually decrease that oxidative damage. And, you know, that's one of the things that we're always really interested and intrigued about when we see someone who, you know, is really fit and he's always running, or she's always, you know, doing all this running, and all of a sudden they have a heart attack. We're wondering, well, how did this happen? Well, a lot of times it happens because they put their bodies into a state of oxidative stress, and they don't have the antioxidants to combat that. Because, you know, when you metabolize and you create more energy at a faster rate, you basically have to offset that with antioxidants, or you're going to get yourself into an oxidative stress state. So, and it's just like, you know, I was telling you about before, when you look at that weight scale, you have to balance it out. So what do we know about caffeine? Well, so we know about its mental acuity benefits. We do know that it does have some negative side effects associated with increasing blood pressure in individuals who are sensitive to that. So, you know, and your doctor's probably, you probably heard your doctor mention that before. But for those who can tolerate it, or those who actually have the ability to, and many individuals do have the ability to basically adjust to that over time, they don't see those negative effects. They only see the positive effects. And these are just some examples of the levels that you typically see in a cup of coffee. So espresso, you know, a lot of people think espresso has a lot of caffeine in it, but because it's such a small volume quantity per serving, it actually ends up being as much as a conventional brewed cup of coffee in most instances. And then the decaf coffees obviously are much lower, and for standard of identity, they have to be less than 4 milligrams per serving. So we know that caffeine in coffee can increase mental alertness. It enhances endurance. It increases metabolism. It can combat fatigue. And now we know that it actually enhances athletic performance and precision. So, ultimately, if you think about it, coffee is the ultimate healthy energy solution. A lot of individuals go on, these energy shots and try and find new and innovative ways to get more energy. And coffee is really, a safe alternative to do that. So here's two studies that I'm sharing, both of which are basically demonstrating the muscle endurance and performance. And here's the first study that basically it had a control, and then it looked at caffeine and taurine, which taurine is known for its effects on positive endurance, especially with bodybuilding and muscular endurance. And as you can see, caffeine actually outperformed when it came to distance than taurine did, and even the combination of caffeine and taurine. And then when we look at lactate, which is what basically the expression of the muscle getting into a state where it's forming and developing, caffeine also performed almost as good when combined with taurine as taurine alone did. So it has some really promising health benefits. So if we look at the summary of the data, coffee consumption is proving to have many significant health benefits. And we see that there's basically this strong correlation between higher coffee consumption, meaning greater than 5 cups a day, seems to have the most overwhelming evidence for things like diabetes prevention and glucose management, but also LDL oxidation reduction and inflammation biomarkers. And caffeine can sometimes be seen as the main culprit to hypertension, but if it's tolerated, it can have some pretty positive health benefits associated with it. But one of the negative things that we found through our studies is that conventional roasting actually reduces some of these natural antioxidants found in coffee. So that's why it requires this higher consumption, this 5 cups a day, to really see these overwhelming health benefits, whereas the 1 to 2 cups a day, you don't necessarily get them. So this is a graph which basically shows you how the polyphenolic acids in the coffee, in the brewed coffee, actually decrease with the roast temperature. So the green beans start out with a relatively high concentration, but then as we roast, because they are water soluble, it only makes sense that they're going to basically roast off when you roast at such high temperatures because you're basically boiling them off. So we actually developed a patented roasting process to be able to retain the goodness of the green bean all the way through to the final brewed cup of coffee. And we don't add anything to it. We just basically harness the power of what's in the green bean all the way through to the final brewed cup. And one of the brand names that actually benefits from this that's in the marketplace today is called Asante Java. Another one, and the Asante Java is through an MLM, a multi-level marketing network, but there's also another one, Cafe Sonora, which is on the retail side as well. But basically the results consistently show significant increased levels of polyphenols. And of course we independently lab validate all this data. But the benefit really is that all of these compounds that are found in the green bean are protected, and it's just basically the way Mother Nature wanted us to drink coffee in the first place before we changed it. And this graph basically is an example of, when we talk about antioxidants and how they're all not created equal, well, this basically shows the antioxidant content of lots of different coffees relative to, for example, the Asante Javas, which are roasted with Healthy Roast. And you can see that there's some consistency in the numbers and antioxidants, but and the Asante Java typically will have, between 100 to 150 milligrams more of antioxidants. But if you look specifically at the polyphenolic compounds in there, which are those water-soluble compounds that help with LDL oxidation and they help with inflammation, there really is a more overwhelming and significant difference because a lot of them are roasted off. So, so that's why, for every 1 to 2 cups of Asante Java, you need 5 to 6 cups of retail coffee to get the same health benefits. And this is just basically substantiating the evidence with another oxidation model, which basically the control and vitamin E, and then another retail coffee and how it relates to the percent of oxidation that happens with LDL oxidation and linoleic acid oxidation, which is essentially another model for LDL oxidation reduction. But the evidence is clear. It really is those polyphenolic acids that help with that LDL oxidation, and you can get those in Asante Java. I put some other resources on there which I think you might find useful. It basically talks a lot about the science going on right now. It gives you the specific citations that I put in the review that I had here, as well as many, many others that I didn't incorporate into my presentation. I think, Dr. David, I think you were going to open it up for some questions.
Absolutely, absolutely. This has been a whirlwind of amazing information. Thank you so much, Chris. All right, I'm going to take this back briefly, and folks, go ahead and type in your questions. Okay? I'm going to take it back briefly to show a slide, and then we'll give it back to Chris afterwards. So please type in your questions, and we're going to keep this show going. There you go. All right, just a minute. There you go. Okay, there's some questions coming in. Okay, well, I want to start with a couple of questions on my own, but before I start the questioning process, we want to make a quick announcement that if you are interested in getting the coffee and trying it for yourself, now Chris did mention Asante Java coffee, which is an MLM, and quite frankly, folks, there is no way we would have been able to get Chris on to do this presentation had it not been for Marianne, who did all the footwork to make sure that she could get on. And as many of you know, this is how we get some of our best presenters. It's through the persistence, really, of some of our attendees in getting these other presenters on the presentation. So whenever people come on like this, we certainly, the best we can do, or the least we can do, is to direct all inquiries to Marianne. And of course, if you want to purchase the coffee from Marianne, the credit goes to her. So please check in with Marianne. Her number is 952-944-4066. That's 952-944-4066. And this is for those of you who cannot see the screen or who are calling in over the phone. Her email address is antioxjava@gmail.com. That's antioxjava@gmail.com. ANTIOX Java, JAVA @gmail.com. Okay, let's go on with the questions. Okay, my question, this is amazing. Okay, 5 to 7 cups of coffee apparently seems to be the ideal to get the best results from the coffee. Is that a good conclusion?
Yes, that's a very good conclusion.
Okay, and sorry about the echo. I'm going to mute myself after the questions have been asked. The side effects that many people are concerned about, and I remember a naturopath who came on our presentation, and he said the first thing he does is that when he has people who have cancer or long-term disease, is stop them from taking coffee, because his main reason is, of course, the acidic environment that coffee produces in people. And of course, we know acidic environment is not good. It helps promote some long-term chronic diseases. That's one. The other thing is that some people complain that coffee raises your stress levels because it stimulates the adrenal glands, and eventually continuous stimulation of the adrenal glands can eventually cause burnout of the adrenal glands, and not just stress in the adrenal glands, but stress in the brain as well, that it may keep people from thinking straight after a while if they have too much caffeine moving through their system. So I'm sure people have these questions, and I've got a couple that I've asked that already. So can we address those first before we go on to the next?
Sure. Okay. So to answer your question about acidification and increased acidification within the gut? Well, basically there are specific compounds in coffee that actually enhance stomach acid secretion, and we actually know a lot more about that. There was a couple scientists who actually developed a really nice model over in Switzerland, and then that model has actually been transferred over to many of the universities that we currently use today. And basically it's looking at the stomach acid secretion levels so that we don't have to basically attack somebody's individual gut to get the samples. But what it tells us is that if we can lower their specific compounds in coffee that basically cause this to happen, and if we can lower those, then we have a net positive effect on stomach acid secretion. And we've been able to do that with our Healthy Roast process, actually, to lower these specific compounds so they don't have this negative side effect. Incidentally enough, a lot of people think it is caffeine that's actually causing that, but it really isn't. There's actually no causal link between the caffeine and those stomach acid secretions. It's other compounds in there. And a lot of people think it's like the caffeic acid, for example, but again, it has no causal link between there. It's basically these things called hydroquinones that actually have that effect. So you know, we know a lot more about the coffee chemistry today than we did, you know, even 5 years ago, and we know a lot more about how that affects acid secretions and how gut metabolism works and how the digestive system works together. And you know, we have some pretty nice data which actually show that basically the compounds in coffee can actually help with digestive problems. And you know, I think you know, I think for every one person that has a negative digestive problem with coffee, I think there's probably 5 that have a positive effect with it, because it does actually help speed up the transfer rate and bowel movements and forces that distal region that, you know, where carbohydrate metabolism sometimes is slowed down to basically flush itself out. So it has some pretty amazing effects in that way. And, you know, and I should have caveated some of this information. If you do have some of these sensitivities to caffeine, you can always go with the decaffeinated route of coffee, which, you know, is readily available. It's on the market, and now we have technologies to be able to not just do what the old-fashioned way, which is solvent extraction, which I do not recommend. If anybody has decaf coffee, I recommend that you spend the extra money and, you know, basically use there's a carbon dioxide extraction, and then there's also water extraction. And it's not just Swiss water, but there's also all kinds of other water extraction technologies out there today. So, you know, there's lots of different ways for you to get decaffeinated coffee without the solvent extraction methods, and so they're safe, they're effective, they don't have the caffeine, plus they give you all these wonderful health benefits.
Wow, thank you. Thank you.
Did I answer your question? Yeah.
I think you did. I think you did. And this is similar, but she's referring to osteoporosis, because here's a question. I have read that one should not drink caffeine or coffee if you have osteoporosis, as it takes the calcium out of your bones. Okay, you address acidity in the stomach, but what do you think about that comment?
Yes, there have been a number of studies. I think I've read 6 of them that actually do support high caffeine intake in soda. So it's specific to certain types of caffeine and their relation to bone density. And so she's absolutely correct, and you should try and minimize your exposure to what we call the synthetic caffeine. So there's been no causal links between the caffeines, the natural caffeine, so those found in cocos, those found in coffees, and those found in teas. But there certainly are strong correlations between the synthetic ones that are typically found in caffeinated beverages. So.
Right. Okay. Makes sense. All right. Is the goodness of coffee reduced if we add soy milk or creamer?
Well, you know, this is a really good question, actually. There are what we call proteins that have a tendency to bind up and coagulate with the antioxidants and reduce its activity level. So yes, in every essence of the word, it will decrease some of the active sites of the antioxidants that are found specifically in coffees and teas. You know, the data isn't very correlative, though, and unfortunately, I wish I could say yes for every, you know, 1 milliliter in 6 ounces, you see this kind of negative effect. But yes, you do see a correlating responds to antioxidant activity when you add things like soy milk, dairy milk, anything that's protein-based into the coffee or tea, for example. Tea is actually where most of the data has been generated, but yes, they kind of follow the same pattern.
So the best way to go is to go black. So the best way to go is to go with black coffee, to have your coffee black then?
The best way to go is with black coffee, but obviously there's lots of people who, who like a little, to reduce the bitterness in the taste profile and to create kind of a smoother profile to it. And so I'm not saying that you reduce the antioxidant to a level where it's not beneficial. So I'm just saying that you might see, for example, a 2% reduction for every milliliter that you add of soy, and probably 2.2 for every mill you add of dairy. So.
Oh, here's a good question.
So still do it, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Okay, here's a good question. How many
next question?
How many cups of coffee is too many?
That is a good question, and I would say it really is an individual tolerance thing because, we've seen individuals within our clinical studies that consume a significant amount of coffee, and they have really great blood profiles, and they have really great energy, and they have no negative side effects. They can sleep like a baby. They don't have any issues. But then we have other individuals who, we increase their dosage for the clinical study by 2 cups a day, and they can't sleep at night. So it really is, unfortunately, it's an individual thing, and a lot of it stems back to how your body reacts and manages, some of the metabolites in caffeine. Because, when we look at the antioxidants, in even the concentrations that we have, we've actually concentrated up. We have processes now and techniques now that we can actually take all those antioxidants from the green bean, and we can concentrate them up and basically make them into a powder. And we can concentrate them up to a form where we can have a 50 weight % powder of those polyphenols, those antioxidants, and we can load that up to 2 grams in each beverage, and you're still seeing a positive benefit from it, and you're still not seeing any negative associations with that high of an intake. So you could continue to keep, I think, drinking as much coffee as your body could possibly handle, and the antioxidants would still have a beneficial effect. The negative side effect is, I think your body would eventually say, okay, I'm either a diuretic because you're giving me way too much caffeine, or I can't sleep because of the activity level.
Right. And I think the caveat also should be that that this is with the right kind of coffee, right? With a really good with a good coffee. Or are we saying this can? I would hate to think that any kind of coffee, because there's some real duds out there, coffee-wise, that we can just keep taking and taking and taking without the other adverse effects.
Yes, you're right. There's a number of coffees that, obviously I won't get into the details on, the brands or anything, but there's a number of coffees on the market today that have very little nutritional value, unfortunately, because of the way that they're processed and because of the way that they're canned, and or the way that they're packaged. And unfortunately, one of the things that we know about antioxidants is because they have this strong ability to oxidize things, if they're exposed to air for too long, or they're not packaged properly and they get oxygen into them, eventually they're going to lose their ability to have any functionality. So you have to, be thinking about all those elements. And you're absolutely right, David. It really depends on, the quality of the bean that you start with, because we know a lot about, growing and harvesting now too, and how that affects antioxidant activity as well. And preserving that integrity all the way through the final brewed cup of coffee takes a little bit of effort.
Right. So let me just get this right. What makes Asante coffee, or specifically what you've helped to formulate and work with over there at Applied Foods, is the fact that first of all, the coffee beans are grown in a very controlled, very natural environment, and Also, the fact that you take the care to extract the vital ingredients, the antioxidants, the polyphenols, before you start the roasting process, and then put them back in after the roasting process. That's what makes this so special and so beneficial and nutritious.
Absolutely. So basically what we have is we have a processing technology that harnesses, the polyphenols off that green bean before it goes through that 450-degree roast. So and then, and the reason that you want to still roast at 450 degrees is because if you don't get the nice sensory profile associated with what we love about coffee. It's caramelization, all these wonderful flavors that come through, and all the wonderful sensory profiles of its aromatic and ability. So you want to still continue to roast at that, and then you have to reintroduce. Then there's only a certain period of time that you could reintroduce those antioxidants and still get them back into the cell wall of the bean and still maintain the integrity of the sensory profile. And then you have to package it in a way that you don't lose it. So while it's sitting on the shelf waiting for someone to open up that package and enjoy it.
Right. Makes sense. Okay, Anita says, great webinar. Thank you. And then she says, my mother recently stopped coffee for 2 weeks, and when she got back on coffee, she said her heart would race. Do you have an explanation?
Yes, absolutely I do. One of the things that happens very quickly in our bodies adapt to metabolic functions very quickly, and one of those is, unfortunately, which is something that we continue to keep talking about, is the role caffeine has in hypertension and blood pressure, and why everybody thinks there's this negative association. Well, it's because that's exactly what happens. It enhances our metabolic activity, and it's a normal response that we all have. And over time, because most of us, gradually introduce ourselves to coffee, and then we can just continue to keep drinking more and more of it, we don't see those negative side effects associated with it. But if you stop and then you start right away, and especially if you start back doing things like, if you were used to having 3 cups a day and then you have 3 cups again after you stop for a while, you're going to see a significant change in that metabolic activity very quickly. And it's not until you give yourself a little bit of time for it to adjust that you're going to see. And unfortunately, as we age, we see that even more significantly. Because, as we age, we have all of these other issues related to what's happening to our metabolism. And so we become much more sensitized to how our cells react to this increase in metabolism, how our heart reacts to it, and how our blood flow reacts to it.
I see. Interesting. So what would you suggest to Anita's mom?
I would suggest that if she loves coffee as much as the rest of us, that she basically introduces it, steadily. So, if she typically has a cup in the morning and then, maybe a cup in the late afternoon to get her through the rest of the day, that would be a good start. And then, then start to go to 2 cups in the morning or whatever she was used to, and do it for a week. And then modify your behavior again the following week and give your body a chance to kind of readjust.
Okay. Well, I have
and if that still doesn't work, of course, you can always go to decaf.
Okay, that may work better. But some people just don't like the taste of decaf, like me. Asante, does it come in an instant format?
No, it does not. There is 6 SKUs now, 4 whole bean, or 4 ground and 2 whole bean.
Okay, and
there are different roast degrees.
Is the decision not to make it instant, is that a quality decision, or, I mean, is that, do you
it really is based on, we've had this conversation a few times, and, it's only been in the last year that we've even gotten serious about it, and it's really thanks to Starbucks, quite honestly. They've changed the way I think individuals perceive and look at, because Asante is a premium coffee, and it's a premium brand, and it uses the finest Arabica beans, and, everybody is accustomed to thinking of specialty coffee as Arabica whole bean in a nice, pretty package. They don't think of it as instant. And it wasn't until Starbucks launched Via that they've kind of changed all that predication, and people are more receptive to saying, okay, instant coffee can taste good. It doesn't have to come in a jar. It doesn't have to be something that, tastes like it's got solvents in it and all that other stuff. So, so I think the discussions are getting a lot more heated now, and they're getting a lot more, just because I think ultimately the consumer perceptions are changing, and so the demand is going to change.
Right. So it is possible to maintain all the good quality and the good taste and still make it instant. Because people who travel like me, I mean, people want to have something, a small pack that they can just get a hot cup of water and pour it into and still enjoy the good quality stuff.
Absolutely.
Okay. So it is possible then.
Yeah, and you know, and your comment on the caffeine, the decaf version is an interesting one, because you're absolutely right. Historically, a lot of the old methods for decaffeination actually didn't produce a very good cup of coffee, because you basically were diluting the characteristics of the bean. And you know, with all these new methods that have come out for decaffeination, you really shouldn't see those negative effects as much. So you know, so I would challenge you, if you really are, you know, a proponent of decaf, to find something that, you know, is made with better processing techniques, and that'll prove to be a much better quality cup of coffee for you.
Got it. All right, Cora wants to know, speaking about decaf, does decaf coffee provide any benefits? If so, what? Did you get that?
Hello?
Hello?
No, sorry, can you repeat it?
Okay.
Yes?
Oh, okay. Let me repeat the question. Cora wants to know, does decaf coffee provide any benefits? If so, what?
Decaf coffee does provide all the antioxidant benefits that we talked about today. The only benefits that it doesn't provide are on the caffeine, and those related to like mental acuity and performance, sports performance, and that sort of thing.
Okay, so that is what we lose out on if we take decaf.
Right, exactly.
All right. Do you consider the best decaf to be the water decaffeinated one or the other one you mentioned?
Well, right now, I would definitely say the water decaffeination is by far and away the most available on the marketplace, and it's easily identifiable by the consumer. So, you know, I gauge that as part of the whole package, because, you know, if it takes you a year to find, you know, the CO2, then, you know, what's the point, right? But if you can go to the store tomorrow and you can, you know, browse the section and flip the bag over and see that it uses a water decaffeination process, that's, you know, that's easy. That's what you want, right?
Right, right. Okay. Is it available outside the U.S.? Someone's in Australia, and I think she wants to know if you can get this in Australia.
You mean Asante Java?
I guess so.
Or just water decaffeinated?
No, I think she's talking about.
You can get water decaffeinated.
I think you're talking about coffee in. Okay, hang on. Let me be sure. He said yes. So I guess he's referring to the decaf, the water decaffeinated. You're right.
Either way, yes is the answer. Yes, you can get water decaffeinated coffees, and basically they're readily available anywhere in the world. You just have to be looking for the right symbol, and they should all be packaged to identify them. So there's usually some kind of water decaffeination symbol on them to indicate such. If they don't say it, it's probably a good indication that they don't use a good practice.
Okay. Okay. All right, Stephen. All right, Stephen. For networking purposes, you're going to probably have to talk to Marianne, and that's her information in front of you. Verna wants to know, what would it take to encourage Asante to produce the breakfast blend in an instant form? I guess pressure. I guess that's what it's going to take, huh?
Yeah, I mean, if the demand is there, definitely they'll consider it. It's really just a function of just ensuring that enough people want it to make it, you know, a cost-effective decision for them. Unfortunately, I know that sounds terrible, but sometimes it's the right approach, because you want to make it a point where it's cost-effective for the consumer, right?
Right, right, right. Okay, Linda Domine has a couple of questions here. Hello, Linda. How are you? All right, here's a question. Might some of the bad side effects of coffee be from one's own fat cells stored that has the stored toxins being brought into the systemic circulation, having to be processed for detoxification? That's a long one. Does it make sense?
So
I think
far?
so far. Okay, so she's saying, could some of the side effects actually be due to the person's having a toxic body himself or herself, and and coffee is actually just helping to improve circulation and therefore bringing the toxins to the surface.
Yeah, and that's one of the main activities of antioxidants that I really didn't even touch on today, is the ability for antioxidants to effectively conjugate and remove toxins from our body. So absolutely, you're right. I mean, when I talk about all this and how it relates to the storage of adipose tissue, and, unfortunately, your body gets into this vicious cycle where, unfortunately, once you start to lose control of your insulin activity and once you start to increase your adipocytes and your fatty tissues, you start to form all these other negative side effects. Like you had mentioned, you start to form more toxins. And so now you need even more antioxidants to combat that. And a lot of people don't make that adjustment because they don't even know to make that adjustment. And, the other negative side effects associated with that are, our adipose tissue actually form aggressive estrogens. So now you have the problem of all these steroidal hormones that are aggressive, also causing these negative side effects and eventually causing these steroid-related cancers. And so really you get in this vicious cycle, and it all has to do with being able to control it at the source and then manage it along the way. So you hit the nail on the head. I think you're right. I think if you can kind of be preemptive a little bit and then think about what you need to do to combat it as you go through the process, you'll avoid all these negative side effects along the way.
Interesting perspective. Okay, here's another question from Linda Domini. And Chris, this question about acidity just keeps on popping up, and I apologize. I know we've asked it in one way, but the questions keep coming up in several different ways. So for some of them, I'll have to bring them up, and please be patient with us as we ask these questions. Okay, so how would you respond to someone thinking that they can't have coffee because it is acidifying or it depletes one's alkalizing minerals? Someone further down mentioned calcium and iron. And then while you're at it, someone talks about acid reflux, that coffee can cause acid reflux. So it's all around the same topic. You want to do that?
Okay, so there's really two things going on here, David. There's this alkylation effect that everybody keeps talking about, which is, basically if you go on the web, I think it's a lot of people are getting their information because they're saying, oh my gosh, this acidity that's forming in our bodies is having this negative effect on our basic pH, our internal pH, and it's having, all these negative side effects with bone mineral density loss and magnesium depletion and vitamin D deficiencies and all of these things. And then there's the side effects associated with just normal GI gut metabolism of just drinking anything, and in this situation we're talking about coffee. So I think some people think about coffee and they say, I drink coffee and I get acid reflux, or I get coffee and I get stomach ache, and and that's a different thing than coffee and the alkalinity thing. So just to be clear on that, they're both completely different mechanisms of action, and they're doing something very differently physiologically inside of us. The one with the acid reflux really has to do more with that stomach acid secretion work that I was talking about before. And you're right, there are specific compounds in coffee that will give individuals, stomach acid upset. And it has more to do with the fact that it's not about the pH at all, really, because if you think about it, our stomachs have a really, really low pH. So it has nothing to do with that. It has more to do with this fostering of the compounds, the specific compounds in some of the coffees out there. And there's some that are better than others. And obviously, that's where some of these chicory roots and some of these other coffees have come from, is they say that they mitigate this. But really, it has more to do with the fact that if you can control those specific compounds, you're going to be able to manage it better. And so my suggestion and my advice on that piece of it is, get away from those coffees that are causing you that problem. And those are typically the lower end, and when I say lower end, the more affordable, the value line priced coffees, because they're not selective for, anything. They're a vehicle to get you the sensory profile in the coffee in your body. That's the intent. So, but as soon as you start going to the premium Arabicas, you shouldn't see any of those problems because, quite honestly, most of the ones that we've tested, and we've tested over 600 different varietals now, of the high-end Arabicas won't have that hormone secretion effect, negative hormone secretion effect on your gut secretion. So that being said, I think, it just is going to take a little bit of due diligence, a little bit of time for you to kind of work through that. But on the other side, on the alkalinity side, there just isn't enough science to prove that coffee specifically. There is enough to prove that caffeine has a negative effect on the alkaline effects. And like I said, it's all stemming around that synthetic caffeine level, but there just isn't enough data to prove otherwise to say one way or the other whether. So, for me as a food scientist and an engineer, I think about, if there's a compound in here that's having a negative side effect, my job is to figure out what it is and to take it out, right? Well, we can't even figure out what that is because there's no correlative effects. So there's no science for me to substantiate doing anything yet. So I can't make a change without knowing all the evidence. And all the data that's out there is just speculative. It's basically people making assumptions that, because coffee is acidic. Well, of course coffee is acidic. There's lots of beverages that are acidic. But your stomach is way more acidic than that. So, you have to kind of think about it in relative terms. It's like thinking about orange juice and stuff. Sometimes orange juice gives people, a problem with their digestive and their gut and stuff, and it has to do with the fact that there's compounds in there that actually just aren't very healthy, for the gut lumen, and some people can handle it, and some people can't.
Right. So the key thing is to go for quality, and then as much as you possibly can, and be selective.
Yeah, when it comes to some of these issues related to acid reflux, absolutely. And, and on the other piece of it, on the alkalinity piece of it, obviously, we're going to continue to keep evolving the science in that area because there are so many people who want to try and understand, all these associations between acidity and, how it relates. And it's not just coffee we're doing it with. It's obviously tea is another big one, and some of these juices too, so.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what, one of the things that was absolutely fascinating were those slides you showed about coffee and diabetes.
Yes.
Oh, my goodness. Listen, could you possibly bring that up again? And while you're doing that, I'll hand it back to you. But I just need to take another look at that slide. But Bob Domini says, I have drunk the Asante Java decaf, and it is the best I have ever tasted. So thank you, Bob, for chiming in. Okay, yeah, let's take a look at that because again, that's almost counterintuitive for some people. Some people actually believe that coffee, the excessive coffee drinking, has been one of the things that have helped burn the adrenal glands and cause us to cause many people to be insulin resistant in the first place. So.
Yeah, and it's counterintuitive to the research, and it's basically non-supportive in the science. So, what we're seeing is, there's basically these compounds in coffee, these polyphenols, that have the ability to help regulate and manage the glucose metabolisms in our body. And they do this basically by, it's almost like a cruise control in your car. So what it's doing is it's saying, I'm going to regulate how much blood glucose you're putting into your bloodstream right now, so that you can effectively manage your insulin activity, because that's, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. It's about us being able to not have to continually trigger insulin to a point where we get desensitized to it. And so if we can do that at the onset, we won't have the negative side effects as we continue to age. And so really that's what those compounds in coffee are doing for us. And, the other amazing thing that we've seen, and some of this work has been done by Kelly Johnston and other top researchers in the field, is they've actually been able to prove how this is really happening. So basically what it's doing is it's transferring the rate of carbohydrate absorption to a distal portion of the gut lumen. So, to say that in layman's terms, it means that, what our bodies don't need for blood glucose management, we basically just don't even absorb. We let them go through, and we say, you know what, I don't need you, I don't want you, and they basically get excreted in the urine and in the bile. And that's a pretty amazing thing to have happening in our bodies that we don't even know is going on. And how we substantiate that and how we know that's happening is there's basically these things called the glucagon-like peptide and the glucose insulinotropic peptide, and they can tell us what's going on in the distal portions of the gut lumen. So they can tell us, is carbohydrate metabolism happening here or is it happening someplace else? And they're basically these chemical receptors that give us feedback. So Kelly Johnson was actually one of the pioneers in this research to be able to tell us, okay, we know this is happening, so we can measure blood glucose response once we take coffee, and we know that we're seeing a decrease, but we don't get why it's happening. But now she's been able, and their entire team's been able to explain why it's happening. And then we're seeing all these secondary benefits to it with insulin management, of course, which, are so promising because it really does drive and dictate all these other chemical reactions that are happening with leptin and adiponectin and with our estrogen, and, they're all kind of interrelated. And so it really becomes more and more powerful. The data just, it just keeps emerging. It's really cool. We actually just completed 2 clinical studies, human clinical studies. We took, as I was mentioning before, there's the technologies out there to be able to take those compounds out of coffee. So we've extracted them out of the coffee bean, and we've actually put them into human clinical studies, and at controlled dosages. And we've seen really great effects on not just blood glucose, but the level of the BMI, so the body mass index, and the weight reduction. So individuals who just take the specific compounds in coffee see a reduction in weight over a period, a short period of time, but they also see a reduction in adipocytes and a reduction in body fat mass. So we know that, it's not, as I'm showing you on that one slide, basically we're forcing the reaction of lipolysis. So we're saying we're not going to use basically all those carbs that we're eating. We're just going to say we don't need those because we got all this excess stuff going on here. Why do we need the stuff we're eating? And we're going to force those triglycerides to break down and lipolysis and fatty acid degradation. So it's really a neat thing that's going on. So
I'll tell you what, that's fascinating. That's just fascinating. Okay, well, go ahead and show the slide, please. I've handed it over to you, so you can just accept. Yeah. We probably should have had it up while we were talking, but I just didn't want to interrupt you. I thought you were just doing a great job.
Yeah, once I get on a roll, I can't shut up.
Good stuff. Amazing stuff.
So here's what's happening. So basically this, let me see if I can get my highlighter to work here. So basically this is the primary pathway that regulates how much glucose that we're eating. So this is the glucose that comes in, whether it's the carbohydrates that we take in or the sugars that we take in. They all break down into this one molecule, this glucose molecule. And this drives this reaction, which is the glucose 6-phosphatase pathway. If we can regulate this, so if we can put this at 55, and set it there, then we're going to control the rate at which glucose goes into there. So if our body needs more than that, it's going to force it to go in this direction. So what typically happens, though, if you don't regulate this, is this goes up to, now you eat a bowl of cereal, it goes up to 80. Then you stop eating, now it goes down to 0. Then you decide you're going to have an apple, it goes up to 60. And it just keeps going up and down, up and down, up and down, and which triggers insulin activity, which forces you in the opposite direction. Because remember what I was telling you about insulin. Insulin forces glycogen stores. It forces you to basically form these triglycerides and these free fatty acids. Remember, glucose stores fat and glycogen and triglycerides. So insulin activity triggers all that. So if you can avoid that whole active site of insulin triggering activity, you can avoid the negative side effects associated with increasing your adipose tissue, increasing your triglycerides, which ultimately increase your fatty acid profile in your bloodstream.
And coffee can help do that, specifically the ingredients in coffee can help do that.
Yeah, the polyphenolic acids in coffee have been proven to do that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I tell you what, Starbucks would probably be very happy to see it. How come they hadn't put you on tour around the country to go speak for them, Starbucks?
I don't know.
They
Probably because I work for Applied Food Sciences, right?
Well, what are we saying here? Do you want the money or do you not want the money?
Yeah, right. No, I just think it's exciting to be able to educate people on, all these plant-based compounds because, I think there's so much hidden science there that we're just uncovering. And, unfortunately, it's kind of the way it goes in our industry because if you can't patent it and if you can't put your name around it because you can't generate commercialization IP around it, it's really hard for you to justify the funding of it. And, in this situation with coffee, it's one of those things where, a lot of people love to talk about coffee, but a lot of people don't like to donate money to the research associated with it because there's so much known in the art and there's so much out there in the public domain that it's hard for any one person to capitalize on it. So if I go ahead and I, basically do all this research on coffee compounds, like you just said, what's to stop Starbucks from going and selling on those concepts and, making all their millions on it? Well, there's nothing from stopping them. So it makes it hard for, for all this research to even happen, for people to justify it. So, I get excited about it because obviously I feel it's something that, people need to know. I mean, everybody needs to understand and know, how plant-based compounds can help them and what they should and shouldn't be doing to incorporate them into their lifestyles. Because, I think we hear too much about all the negative stuff and we don't hear enough about the positive stuff.
Right, right. Boy, okay. And Chris, I know we've had you for a while. Listen, when you're tired and you need to go, just let me know. We'll shut this whole thing up. But this is just amazing, amazing stuff. Okay, just let me know. Well, the quick questions keep coming in. And Hank says, "Great show, thank you." All right, here's a question by Art. I like this. What was the eureka moment in your 7-year experience of developing, perfecting the healthy roast process? Thanks.
Well, I think, we struggled a lot with trying to figure out exactly, because once we identified the compounds in there, it was an obvious, it was a pretty obvious identification that it was these polyphenolic acids. But, I think our aha moment came when the fact that we figured out how you can reintroduce them into the bean and still maintain the integrity of the antioxidant and still maintain the integrity of the sensory profile of the final brewed cup of coffee. Because that took a lot of effort. We were using all of these different natural processes that you typically use in food technology today. And unfortunately, they kept reintroducing chemicals back into it, whether it be sodium bicarbonate or calcium salts to bind to it or this, that, and the other thing. And, what really struck us as a unique thing was that if we just let the bean act in a natural state, it opened up its cell wall and wanted that antioxidant right back into it again. And that was a pretty amazing thing for us to see. And it just happened, it happened in our pilot facility that over time, we just kept beating our head against the wall saying, no, I don't want to add that. No, I don't want to do that. That doesn't make sense when you're trying to keep everything all natural to, start adding, another chemical to it. So, yeah, it was pretty interesting when that happened. So that was our big aha moment, I think.
Wow. So there's the fact that it was possible to do that without compromising the integrity of the coffee.
Yeah, and without having to do it through some of these conventional food chemical processes that, require you to, change the pH and add acids and then add bases to it and then add chemical carriers to it and then put this in there and then, modify the pressure and, I mean, sometimes if you just let, Mother Nature act in the way that she's supposed to act, magic happens.
Yeah, but don't forget, we're Americans. We don't like waiting for Mother Nature. She takes too long.
Right. I think I have time for 2 more questions, David.
Sounds good. Sounds good. All right. Art, again, how does the level of good antioxidants compare with the between the breakfast blend whole bean and the ground coffee versions?
Okay, so basically, if I were to compare breakfast blend whole bean versus breakfast blend ground, from an antioxidant perspective, there's absolutely no difference. But if I were to compare breakfast blend versus dark roast, there is a difference. There's about a 48 milligram per serving difference between the two. So the darker you roast, the more antioxidants come off. And our process basically adds a certain level of antioxidants from the original green onto the final, but it's the same level independent of roast type. So you'll see a slight change or variation in the antioxidant content as you decrease basically or increase the roasting, which basically decreases the roast profile. Does that make sense? Did I say that clearly enough, David?
I think so. Makes sense to me. Art, if that's not satisfactory enough for you, send a shoot quick chats, and we'll clarify it before we wrap up. We'll close for tonight. Okay. Another question by Art. Man, he's a late starter, isn't he? Okay, Art. When will Asante? I was just kidding about that, by the way. When will Asante K-Cups be available? The K-Cup market is huge. And I don't know what K-Cup is. What's a K-Cup?
A K-Cup is one of the cups that you find in the instant machines now. It's basically, the technology was actually started by Krug, which is out of Europe, and it's kind of proliferated through the years. Green Mountain kind of took it on and put their own technology into place. And basically it's, it's the small little pea pod cups that you can stick into those universal machines now, and it gives you the ability to basically make a good cup of coffee from a concentrated extract. So when they are going to be available, I have no idea. So I am sorry, I do not know the answer to that. But I bet if you called into the Asante Java line, they might know.
Right.
Or maybe Mariana would know.
Maybe Marianne would know. Yeah, Marianne knows a lot of things. Okay. Well, again, thank you, Chris. And I certainly hope that this will not be your last presentation. I hope we have treated you well and to your satisfaction. By the way, we are going to get you back, after all, on the, I believe it's the 19th. You're going to be back on to talk about the liver and detoxification, correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the 19th.
19th of May. I think I have it down for the 19th of May, but we can confirm that afterwards.
Okay, great.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for this. This has been really eye-opening, and I think we have a lot of people on who really appreciate the information you've taken the time to share with us tonight.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for staying up late, everybody. I appreciate the audience.
All right, and Linda says, absolutely awesome presentation, Chris. All right, and I think that's the best way to wrap it up. And again, say thank you, a big thank you to Marianne for helping make this happen. All right, everyone.
Absolutely, thanks, Marianne. Bye-bye.
God bless. Good night. Bye.